Hi, welcome to the second video as we take a closer look at Hyflex and how we can really address and embrace Hyflex instruction in the classroom. So during this video, we're going to talk about actually how to take your course and your learning objectives and make sure that we address them regardless of what modality the students choose to participate in. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So to talk about different pieces of the Hyflex course itself is super important. The first thing to acknowledge is a robust online course. What you're going to see here at the college is we really are going to take the time to make sure that we can help you make your online piece as strong and robust as possible. In other words, is it clearly set up? Does it have activities and assessment in it that make it so that the student can understand why they're moving from one section to the next and how to do so and get the most out of each activity that's in that online course? That's where Hyflex courses start, is with that really strong online component of it, whether it be the discussion boards or the instructions that are involved or the videos that are involved. The next thing to think about, and these pieces could have videos, honestly, all of themselves, but make sure that all your learning outcomes or objectives that you have in your course overall, but also within each chapter or topic, are aligned to the assessments and the activities that are in that topic. Many of you have heard of backward design. This is what it's all about right here, is making sure that you start with your learning outcomes and say, okay, this is the lecture or the assessment that helps students meet that learning outcome, not the other way around. So it's not saying to students, here's an activity, and then we try to fill in the blank and say, this is what we were going to learn out of this. So to make sure that we're following the backward design components. We have to look about whether our assignments and our assessments are equitable across all of modalities. Remember in the first video, we talked about that students can join asynchronously, which means participating completely online, synchronously, which means that they participate through teams, or in person. Well, how do we make sure that regardless of how a student participates, they are being addressed equitably? They're being assessed equitably regardless. So in other words, if there's a test or an assessment, if the people take it at home, do they have an unfair advantage because they can use online resources versus they can't if they're in the classroom? Maybe we need to have open book assessments more often. So always looking at that equitable part and making sure we hit all their needs. We might want to also make sure we look at, do you have consistency across topics? Now, I call a chapter, you might call it a topic, but they're in Moodle or Canvas where you have topics or chapters. Can we make the most structure possible so it's consistent for each chapter, each topic, it's consistent. This is super helpful because given the nature of Hyflex modality, there are a lot of different ways a student might get involved, and that might change, and that might be up and down. That part might be a little off and on. If you can give them that clear structure as much as possible, and it's consistent every single chapter, that's going to be helpful for them to really make sure they track what they need to be doing, when it's assigned, when it's due, and what to expect in the next chapter or topic. The final thing is ensure engagement across all modalities. Listen, this is the tricky part. This is the part that is so important for Hyflex courses, and a part that you can kind of give or take if you're just in the classroom, but you can't do it. If you're trying to hit all these modalities, you have to look at, how do I ensure that student engagement? If a person is online, are they truly as engaged with the subject matter that you're talking about as if they were sitting there getting it from you straight face to face? How to make sure we do that. The other thing I just want to put in here is timing awareness. And I know this seems kind of silly, but I cannot stress enough, when you're making your structure for your course, if in the past you might have been able to wing it a little bit, right, when we are in person. So right now you're going to really want to think about timing, because the activities that you might introduce to your class might take a little bit longer, for example, because you are having to address a technology issue, maybe like, set up a breakout room before you can have a small group discussion. So think about increasing some timing when you do your activities to make sure you can get it all in during a class period. The next part are instructions. This part is so important that I feel like if you could really just take one thing out of this all these videos, I would love for you to take this out. Instructions are so important in the Hyflex world. They're important because we cannot assume that a student knows their role or the expectations of them in a Hyflex world and in a Hyflex class. So listing those instructions maybe in a document, in the syllabus, in a separate Word document, talking about them again in a video, a very short video is fine, revisiting instructions during the class period verbally. As many times as you can redo instructions, the better off I think you're going to find. Don't assume that students know how to use Microsoft Teams or that they know how to use Moodle or that they know how to use Poll Everywhere. Think in advance about all the technologies you're going to be asking them to utilize during your class. Remember we talked about this is really important for accessibility. Make sure you have instructions for all of those as well. We're going to talk later about, having working documents that our students agree upon. Like, it's one thing to say we're going to have a group discussion with people on Teams. It's another thing to say this is what common etiquette is during those group discussions. How do you participate? When do you put yourself on mute? When are you allowed to speak? And having those types of working agreements listed out and revisited on a regular basis. The other thing that's really important for Hyflex as far as instructions is attendance. Helping a student understand what you consider in attendance if they're online. It might be different than if they're in attendance visiting through Microsoft Teams or in person in the classroom. The way you expected attendance to be taken might be different than the person who taught the class right before you or that they had last semester. So really making sure that you articulate the importance of attendance during your session and what it means for you in your class. The final thing in there is the ADA compliance. We've talked about this in past years as far as what ADA compliance means in your online class. Really taking the time, and you can meet with eLearning to help you right here to say, okay, my online component is ADA compliant. That's super. Now I have people coming in the classroom and on Teams. I have PowerPoint presentations. How do I make sure that they can that those are PowerPoint presentations are compliant and that they can be used to maximize the learning in the classroom? So all these things are things to think about during your class. All right. So the next thing to think about is aligning to learning outcomes. I did address this before, and we're going to be having some workshops to help you do this with your courses. Remember I talked about that according to backward design, we start with a learning outcome, and then we design and align our materials, our lectures, our assessments, our activities. Everything gets aligned to those learning outcomes. That's why it's so important to have them articulated on your online site so that students can understand we're doing this activity to get to this. And so that you as an instructor make sure that you have activities and assignments that address every single one of those learning outcomes. Instead of the traditional other way around, which is we have an activity that we like to do and we hope it hits something that they need to learn in the class. So backward design is really important. It's also important to think about if we're going to have students that are participating online completely, how are they going to hit that learning outcome and reach that learning outcome? That might be different than how we had the person the student in the classroom hit them. In other words, if one person online is learning through a discussion board, the person in the classroom might be learning through a group discussion, fishbowl, which we'll talk about later. So as long as all of the modalities are being addressed for the learning outcome, we're good. So just a visual to help you think about that. I did want to make sure some of us are visual learners and some of us are linear learners. So let me just look at this and put this out here. You don't have to do this. But one of the things to think about is that you might have a way of addressing every single one of your topics or your chapters or your learning outcomes. Why not articulate for your students so that they can see how you're doing it, so that there's a consistency? Remember, I talked about that before. I put this up here because I thought, wouldn't it be helpful if they knew that every single time they come into a classroom, virtually or online, there's an introduction, and then we have a short micro lecture, and then we have some activities and assessments for those micro lectures. And then we'll have another micro lecture and an activity and assessment for that one. And then at the end, we have a close. So once again, what you can see here is a representation visually for yourself as an instructor to make sure you hit your learning outcomes, but also for the students so that they can see this is how your course will be designed this semester. The next thing I wanted to show you, and this is, we can get copies of it for you for the instructors, but do you remember we talked about aligning our activities and assessments to all the learning outcomes? The reason I wanted to show you this is that it's helpful as you design your class to Hyflex to really make sure that you are thinking about each of your chapters and really breaking them down to say, okay, this is an icebreaker or an introduction. This is the learning outcome that we're going to be addressing. This is the activities that we're going to be doing, but even more so, here's how this is the important part here. Here's how my synchronous in-person students are going to get to that outcome or activity. Here's how my synchronous online participants, the Teams people, are going to get to that outcome or activity, and here's how my asynchronous online participants will get to it. So it's literally looking through every single thing you do in the classroom to say how are each of these modalities, each day, each topic going to be able to address that. It's a linear way to think about it. We can get you copies of this as well. Okay, so this is the final activity that I have for this video, and I would ask you seriously to take a moment after this video, before you start video number 3, to do a think, pair, share. And we'll describe what that is if you're not familiar with it. It's pretty common sense. But I would like you to take one topic or chapter from your existing course, anything you're already teaching. Identify the learning outcomes and objectives for this topic. And then, using the template that I provided in chapter 2, or whatever template you want to use, really take a moment to say, okay, here's my outcomes. Here are the way that synchronous in person, synchronous through Teams, and asynchronous students are going to address those, and really list them all out. Share that template with someone else who teaches at the college or teaches anywhere for that matter, just to get their feedback on, does this kind of make sense, and are we going in the right direction? And then come back with your team here at SPCC and say, here are some of the things that we've learned during this time. So before you go on to video 3, go ahead and do this think, pair, share. What I would introduce you to next chapter, the next video, is we're going to really talk about how to ensure engagement during the Hyflex course. I mentioned before how important it is. We'll find out how.